Ladies, gentlemen, and listeners, welcome to this episode of the Justice Team Podcast. And today we're tackling a very newsworthy subject, and that is toxic torts. And those involve not only what happened in East Palestine, Ohio, with the train wreck there. We're talking about mesothelioma. We're talking about talc powder. We're talking about why Eric Brown, one of our guests, lost all of his hair early. We're talking about all that fun stuff. So I'm going to introduce our guests that we have on here today because we have some of the best trial lawyers in the nation that are actually out there trying these cases to hold corporations accountable. And they're going to tell you what they're seeing. They're going to talk to you about recent events that are happening in Ohio and kind of how the landscape is. So first we have on today is Ben Adams. And Ben, he's a partner and trial lawyer at Dean, Omar, Branham, and Shirley. Ben actually went to UC San Diego. I think everybody here went to California law schools, which is pretty cool. I know Mark and Eric went to Pepperdine, so me too. You guys are awesome for that. But, Ben, I want to hear a little bit more because I know that, your story, because you're passionate about this because your dad got hurt. You're fighting for justice for the little folks. And then you started off just taking a job out of law school, throwing people out of their homes. And now you're throwing SEO or CEOs of bad corporations out of their fucking homes. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Bob. I'm really excited to be here. I've been doing asbestos litigation, mostly toxic torts and PI, a lot of mesothelioma cases for about 13 years. It is true that, I went to law school thinking I would help people and would, be like the lawyers I saw on TV and Aaron Brockovich and things like that. And then I graduated law school and there were no jobs, so I took a job at a firm working for big banks, evicting people from their homes. And so I would go to court almost every day. Sometimes the defendant or the other side wouldn't have a lawyer. There'd be a family there crying, and we'd take their home away for Bank of America. And I just thought, this is not what I want to do. Okay. This is not what I want to do. And sometimes I'd go to the parking lot, and the family would be there in the parking lot, having just lost their home, and I'd be like, I gotta get out of here. So I had an opportunity through a friend to start working on mesothelioma cases, and I just loved it from day one, and I've continued to do it ever since.
And for those that don't know, mesothelioma is kind of leading for asbestos when you hear about asbestos litigation and all that stuff. And Ben actually is out there trying these cases. I mean, recently December of 2022 hit a $50 million+ verdict against Avon and Heister for. This is about the mesothelioma and with talc use. I mean, this is very interesting. We're going to dive into that in a second because Mark and I had a conversation about this earlier. But just so everybody knows out there, Ben's out there on the streets. He's also in the courtrooms holding people accountable. We're also going to introduce to you Eric Brown. And for those of you who do not know Eric Brown, he was on Bourbon of Proof. We've heard his life story, downtown Eric Brown. He is a partner at his law firm. They do almost a lot of mesothelioma cases, toxic torts. But Eric has tried cases across the country, from Philadelphia to the rural sticks of the southeast United States and to California. So, Eric, thanks for coming on, buddy. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you, man. I have not made any families cry, but I'm totally teasing. But, yeah, man, it's certainly a pleasure to be here.
Eric, are you a true blood? Have you only done work for the people?
Yeah. So when I got out of Pepperdine, I had these visions of grandeur. I wanted to be in entertainment law. And unfortunately, it wasn't as easy to get into as one might think. And, it's not as fulfilling. It's basically contract work. So I started applying at different firms that I had heard of on the websites or whatever. And I got hired by a guy named John Quisenberry, who used to be partners with Brian Kabatak, and they had just split up. They were really big in the 1994 earthquake litigation. So I came in right at the tail end of that, and I was doing insurance bad faith stuff. So helping little people that have been screwed over by insurance companies was my first intro to helping people. And after doing that for a few years, I got wind of a job opening by a firm called Brown and Mark Bratt, which was a huge Texas firm, which at the time might have been the biggest plaintiffs firm in the nation. And they were opening up a Los Angeles office because California was the place to be. They had some serious tort reform going on in Texas. So lot of firms were looking to open up shop in California. So I was one of the first lawyers hired in LA. Did that for, I want to say 6, 7 years. Then opened up my own shop in 2010.
Love it. And I think Ben just started practicing in 2010. I think, Eric, you were graduated in 2003. I think you started something like this.
Yeah, I was, I think, 2 years in front of you, right?
Yeah, it was 2005. Mark, you were 2005 or 6 or 4?
6.
Yeah. Yeah. So Mark, the last guest that we have on here today, also started doing mesothelioma cases. Mark has his own firm now. He's in Culver City, but Mark has now been on his own for a little over a year, and I think has been able. One of the best success stories I've seen is been able to scale his practice and bring in 7 figures his first year. And that takes a lot of patience and doing things the right way and bringing in the right cases, but also knowing what the fuck you're doing, to be honest. Mark's also a good friend, and we collaborate and talk a lot about other things. But, Mark, one of the things that was very interesting I saw about you is your favorite whiskey is Weller. So I just wanted to ask you, why Weller?
I've been lucky enough through friends and paying way too much money to have, try a lot of things, including, another Weller brand, Pappy. And I don't know, it's just about the sweet taste of Weller 12. I love it, and it's my go-to.
What's so good about it, though? I'm just curious.
A lot of people like different types of whiskey. I tend to not enjoy the peaty taste much, so I like the sweet taste of corn-based whiskey, and it just sits on the tongue well and goes down easy.
Just like Eric in front of his opponent in the courtrooms, who goes down easy. Mark also is he plays Uno regularly, as do I. I love that game. So I got to ask you this also real quick, Mark. When you play Uno, if somebody puts down a draw 4, can I then put down a draw 4 and someone's drawing 8, or do you play the wrong way?
Our family does not follow those rules, but I have played in games where those rules are followed and quite enjoy it. But I regularly spar with my 6-year-old daughter, and at the end of the day, I try to reserve the draw 4s for my wife as opposed to my daughter. So anyway, with a game of 3, that rule is not one that we follow.
Yeah, Mark is also recently being addicted to tattoos, just as Eric Brown is, just as I am. And I don't know about Ben, but I hear after Ben's if you get a 9-figure verdict, Ben, I think you have to get a tattoo on your ass
or face. Yeah,
at least one. Come on.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the recent stuff. And I'm going to start with Ben on this one. Kind of tell us about what a toxic tort is. We have a lot of law students, young lawyers, and just people interested in legal space. What is a toxic tort? And it kind of tie it into what's going on in East Palestine, Ohio.
Well, my focus is really on mesothelioma. So when I think of a toxic tort, I think of an exposure to a toxic substance leading to, a disease. And in the case of mesothelioma, it's asbestos. Mesothelioma is a terminal cancer with only one cause, and that's asbestos. Essentially one cause. And so when someone develops mesothelioma, that they've been exposed to asbestos. And yeah.
But in your most recent verdict, you had a woman that was using, I believe it was, where she was using talc powder.
Yeah. So
how does that happen? How does she get that type of cancer in the area that she got? If you can explain to our listeners, not a lot of people know that. I was shocked when Mark told me about this.
So talc is a rock or a mineral that grows in the ground, and so is asbestos. Asbestos, I always just say it's a rock. I think technically it's a mineral, but it's a rock that's mined out of the ground and was put into products for decades for all sorts of reasons. But it grows in the ground. And so talc and asbestos, depending on the region, grow in the ground together. And so when they mine the talc out of the ground and grind it up into a powder to go in a baby powder or a makeup or a body powder or a face powder, it can have asbestos impurities in the talc. And so when women dust themselves with talc, they breathe the talc and they breathe in some of the asbestos. and over time that can lead to mesothelioma. People explain it sometimes like the fat in a steak. The steak meat itself is the talc, and the veins of fat in the steak are like the asbestos. So if you grind up the steak into ground beef, you have that fat in the steak, which is like the asbestos in the talc.
So, but Mark, how easy is it to separate those two? I mean, can you easily separate the asbestos from the talc?
No, it's virtually impossible, and that's kind of the struggle. Even though industry back in the 50s and 60s was well aware that the two minerals were basically mineral cousins and always present, no matter where the mine is in the world, they tried all these techniques. They tried floating techniques where they used different viscosities to try to float out the asbestos from the talc. Didn't work. They tried to more carefully mine it. But the truth is, when you're taking a mineral from the Earth's crust, you don't use a very precise method. You blast it out with fucking dynamite. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to blast it out, and then small amounts of other minerals, including asbestos, which is one of the most dangerous toxins known to men in causing cancer, is going to be an impurity in the finished product. And the companies knew this, and they hid it from all of us, and they hid it from the FDA, and here we are.
Well, what companies, I mean, you can name names on the show. What are the companies, the big ones that were hiding this, and what decades were we talking about?
Johnson & Johnson was one of the ringleaders in miscommunicating information to the FDA and also manipulating the science in a way that would essentially mislead folks like us who are investigating them in a courtroom setting for decades. They were communicating with the FDA back in the 1960s and 1970s when the FDA was formed, but they were communicating with the government in the 60s and in the 70s. And it's not just them. They were using their, it's called the CTFA. It's the consumer group for the talc companies. So it's Johnson & Johnson, Whitaker, Clark & Daniels, Colgate, Palmolive. We know Colgate from toothbrush, but they made products like Cashmere Bouquet. And the list goes on. These are mining companies. These are finished product talc companies. And frankly, Johnson & Johnson was both. They actually owned a mine for a period of time, ultimately sold it, but they knew that asbestos was an impurity that was uniformly found in talc products. And we can talk a little bit about the way that they misled things with the testing they essentially chose to use to self-regulate in a bit. But they knew it. It was a hazard, and we didn't know about it as consumers.
And then, Bob, one more kick to the nuts, Bob, if I can just add on this. One more kick to the nuts is Johnson & Johnson just tried to declare bankruptcy of all their asbestos litigation. So they did what's called the Texas two-step, where they create like a shell company or this random offshoot. They spin off all of their asbestos and talc liabilities, and then they just bankrupt that company. So people that have been injured and sickened and all that from their talc just can't get any money. And notably, their bankruptcy just got kicked out as, I don't want to say fraudulent, but the bankruptcy court's like, no, you can't do that. So apparently it's going up to the Supreme Court. I don't know if anything's been filed yet. You guys know if something's been filed with the Supreme Court yet?
Yeah, J&J filed their, I think it was a motion for reconsideration, actually. Okay. But I saw it come through. Yeah.
So yeah, they got kicked out of bankruptcy court, and now they're taking it up to the Supreme. So we'll see what happens.
And that's why it's so important for to have elected officials to appoint judges, because now you can see how it's going to affect consumers all the way down. People that have been harmed catastrophically since the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Well, Eric, a question I had for you is why do we hear all these mesothelioma commercials now if this stuff was going on back in the 40s, 50s, 60s?
Well, it's because it has a very long latency period. And a latency period is something that if you take the date of first exposure to the date of onset of disease. And the literature says that from when you're first exposed up until when you're diagnosed, you first start to see disease. It could be anywhere from 15, 20 years up to maybe 60 years. So for somebody who might have been in Vietnam, who might have been in the Korean War, who might have, done construction work, let's say in the 60s or 70s, you're still starting to see mesotheliomas because, 50, 60 years down the road, this is when it pops up.
Wow. So, and Mark, we were talking about how, some of the wives of the miners that were getting, breathing asbestos, they started to develop cancer. Usually when I think of mesothelioma and asbestos, and maybe our listeners, you think about it being in someone's lungs, and that's where the cancer is starting. Haven't you seen it starting other places? And then how do you link those things together?
Yeah, mesothelioma is actually a disease of the mesothelial cells, and those cells are found in very specific locations in the body. It's basically a thin single cell membrane that surrounds the lungs, but it also surrounds the peritoneal cavity, which is basically the stomach cavity. It also surrounds the heart. And then in men, because when we're developing inside our mothers, our testicles drop from the peritoneal cavity, and they also surround the testicles. So you will find mesothelioma in those four spots: the pleura, or what surrounds the lungs, the stomach cavity, around the heart, and on the testicles. Everything besides the lungs just occur slightly less frequently. It's already a very rare disease. There's only about 2,500 people that get diagnosed with it in a given year in the United States. But just based upon how it enters the body and then moves its way to the target site for the cancer, which is typically through the lymphatic system, so our lymph nodes and everything go to really all over our body. So asbestos can make its way into that fluid and flow to different locations, and it just happens less frequently around the heart and in men around the testicles.
Yeah. And Ben, so whenever the most recent verdict you had, these verdicts, you've had the opportunity to get what's called punitive damages. And for our listeners, that means, punishment for wrongdoers, a heightened burden of proof for people to be able to be held accountable. Can you kind of walk us through how you're able to obtain not just the compensation for people's pain and suffering, but to punish these companies and how you got there?
Sure. I do want to say the most recent verdict I tried with Jessica Dean, so it wasn't just myself. There were other lawyers who we basically split the case with.
Yeah, and Jessica, we wanted to get Jessica on, but she's back to back for a few trials, and she's a rock star. So yeah,
she's opening in South Carolina as we speak. The punitive damages, the sort of difference in my mind is there are levels of knowledge of what the companies knew about the hazards before your client was exposed. The way I sort of explain it is there are different levels of knowledge. There is something called constructive knowledge, which is the company didn't actually know, but they could have known if they went and they looked. If they went to the library, if they read a book, they could have known. And then there's actual knowledge, which is they actually did go to the library. They did read the book. They did see that asbestos caused death and disease, and they did nothing. They didn't warn. They didn't protect. They didn't recall. And then there's kind of a third level of knowledge, which I think is the highest level of knowledge that there is, and that's experiential knowledge. It's one thing to read something in a book. It's another to experience it in real life, and people know that and understand that. To actually live it is something quite different. And some of these companies, they lived it. Their own people were dying of mesothelioma, and they continued to sell the products and install the products without warning.
But what are how much are these companies, how much have they made off of these products over the years?
Well, it's hundreds of millions of dollars to they built their entire business on it. Some of these brake companies, they literally they're multi-billion-dollar companies, and they built their business from day one on asbestos. And so in our most recent case, so the standard is essentially, negligence is you should have known or you could have known, and punitive damages are you actually knew. And so that's what we try to prove. We try to prove actual knowledge of the hazards of asbestos products and doing nothing. In our most recent case, we were able to prove that Heister, the manufacturer of forklifts that had asbestos-containing brakes in them, actually received warnings from one of their suppliers and took the brakes out of the box with the warning on it, threw the box away, put it in a new Heister box, and sent it out to my guy's family with no warning for, I think it was over a decade.
Wow.
And so those are the kind of facts that that justify punitive damages.
Well, and Mark, you mentioned this before, but there is supposed to be some sort of consumer regulatory group that these companies get together and supposed to be their own watchdog. Like, how did that not work? How does that not work?
I mean, we could take it back to what's going on in Ohio, right? If we rely upon companies to regulate themselves, they're always invariably going to choose what's best for the shareholders and what's best for profits. Unless there is rules, regulations in place that force them to act appropriately or check on safety or do certain things, it's scary. And that happened. We can look to what happened in the talc industry historically. We can look back at the asbestos industry generally. And, I'm going to say this about the government. Usually when the government acts, they are coming in after the problem has become an immense issue. OSHA was created in 1972, and the first thing they were tasked with doing was regulating asbestos in the workplace.
Wow.
Since then, the amount of asbestos that's permitted in the workplace, and when I say permitted, it doesn't mean it's safe. It just means that these are the levels that when you balance everything, including what it costs for industry, because industry is involved in this process, they weigh in heavily about, well, if you make the regulations too hard, we'll go out of business, and that's not good for our economy, etc. But in 1972, what they allowed has now since gone down to a tremendously low level, because they know that if they reduce it, then bad things like scarring diseases and other things are going to be prevented. However, they may reduce cancers; they're not going to entirely eliminate them. But yeah, OSHA came in 72, but it was a problem for decades before. Workers were dying decades before, and the government finally acted in 72. So when we're talking about what's going on with Ohio and the train wreck and the failures, by the company itself, this is not a derailment. It's a disaster. It's a man-made issue. I know we haven't really touched on it, but vinyl chloride.
Because on February 3rd in East Palestine, Ohio, which is a Norfolk Southern train, had 38 cars derailed, 10 of which contain toxic and hazardous materials and chemicals, one including vinyl chloride. So just tell us, listeners, what is vinyl chloride and how does it fuck us up?
Yeah, it's basically a colorless
scientific
gas.
terms.
Yeah, it's actually in peer-reviewed literature. It says fuck you up.
Listen, the short of it is it's a colorless gas, highly flammable, and is really only used. It's a man-made product. It's not naturally, in the earth somewhere. It's made purely to profit, and so it's highly toxic. It's a Class 1A known human carcinogen. It causes liver cancer. And basically the amount that was released when this train disaster wreck occurred is 1.1, million particles. I'm not sure the metric or the measurement, but it's equivalent to all the amount that has been released, in all of industry around the whole country.
Wow.
Over the past, year or so. So,
but is this then centralized just within East Palestine, Ohio, or have you, in your experience, seen this have a mushroom effect over many, many geographic regions?
Yes, and I know Eric's, probably he can weigh on this as well. But in just using our experience in asbestos cases, we have all represented people that either lived near by a plant or a mine or something where they may have lived miles away from the plant, but yet still got mesothelioma with either no other identifiable exposure to asbestos. And the issue is that they lived downwind of this company that was spewing a carcinogen into the air. It would blow through the air and people would breathe it. And if they breathed it, because they lived there every single day, 24/7, over the course of however many years they lived there, that was enough of an exposure to increase their risk for mesothelioma. And it's the same concern we have in Ohio. People that live downwind are going to breathe this vinyl chloride. And yes, there's acute, immediate things. People are getting rashes and have lung issues, and it's hurting them. The real concern is down the road and what's going to happen to them, or downstream, because it apparently has gotten all in the water system and in the water and the streams and rivers.
Yeah, and so what are the types of cancers that you could see stemming from vinyl chloride exposure, and then what is the latency period that that Eric brought up, or larceny? Was it larceny or latency, Eric?
Latency.
Yes, got it. Okay.
Larceny is the next podcast topic. And
well, no, I like larceny. I like larceny, like their bourbon. It's a good one, and I know. Yeah. I like to tease Eric because his favorite whiskey is Connemara.
Hell yeah.
It's an Irish whiskey, which is fine. It's fine. Ben, what's your favorite whiskey? We didn't ask you that question before.
I'm not a huge whiskey drinker. You're probably going to delete me from the podcast immediately. But I did go to a bourbon tasting for our firm holiday party in Texas. Everyone in our Texas office is obsessed with bourbon. So I have tasted a few. I honestly just don't have a favorite one. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Is
everybody else here also
me?
Is everybody here also licensed in Texas?
Working on it.
I'm not.
No, Ben, I know you have. I've seen you. You've been a super lawyer in Texas. I saw that.
I guess so.
Well, Bob, you're licensed in Texas, right?
Yeah, I'm licensed in Texas. So
Oh, really?
Yeah. So just kind of continue to educate us, because the latency period of these, if people are exposed now to vinyl chloride exposure, how much longer are we going to see the effects of this disaster that happened on February 3rd?
What I know, and admittedly, this is all just happening. So I've been reading up on the science and really trying to learn a lot more about vinyl chloride, which is exactly how, Ben, Eric, or I would approach any sort of toxic exposure case. Invariably, when something happens, there's already a bunch of information out there in the medical and scientific community about increased risks for exposure. Liver cancer is directly related to vinyl chloride exposures. And I'm sure as time goes on, there's going to be a lot more studies put into this, because when something big happens like this, where it's in the news, the scientific community and the medical community take notice, and more interest is put in, which is typically generated by money. We always have to be a little skeptical here. So, at the bottom of any sort of new literature that happens since this has occurred, you want to look at the bottom and see who funded this. Anything funded by Norfolk, we might be a little bit skeptical about. And we deal with that all the time in asbestos cases.
Do you mean to tell me that the studies funded by the NFL that said concussions aren't a real thing is not valid?
Eric, what company does that? Is that Camelot? Or wait,
Yeah.
the NFL basically hired the same company.
Yeah.
No, it was what's it called? It was Exponent. Yeah.
Oh, Exponent, the guys in Arizona that they hire in every product defect case to say that products are safe.
They're everywhere, right? Exponents everywhere, man. They've got places everywhere.
Yeah, and
it's
it's
skyscrapers.
We get confronted with these studies all the time and all the trials that we do, and you could just look who funded it, what's their sample size, and it's just crazy how often, like, the Insurance Institute of America is the one funding these studies to say people can't get hurt in rear end crashes, or cigarettes are safe. I mean, there's a famous photograph of all these Yale-educated doctors raising their right hand in front of Congress and testifying that cigarettes were safe.
Of course.
Yes.
So Ben, kind of walk us through, like, what should people in East Liverpool and the surrounding areas, what are some things that they should be doing, like, right now?
East Palestine.
Palestine. What did I say?
Liverpool.
Ah, God. See, Eric's on here. Every time I see Eric, I think of soccer. I don't know why.
There you go. You'll never walk alone, right? That's a Liverpool saying.
See, I knew he knew.
They should be trying to minimize their dose of exposure to the toxin, I think, is a general rule. I don't know as much about the East Palestine issue as Eric and Mark, but they should certainly be trying to minimize their dose, and they should probably be contacting lawyers. There are sort of some fundamentals of toxic tort cases for young lawyers. You mentioned law school students earlier, that we can talk about what makes a strong case, how to work up a case. I don't know if you want to talk about that right now, but one of the things is the dose of exposure, the amount of the toxin that went into somebody's body. And so minimizing that is really what they should be doing.
I think there's an evacuation order actually in the immediate area around that train accident.
When did that happen?
I think just a couple days ago they issued a evac order. I don't know what people are going to do. I don't know how they're paying for alternate living situations. I have no idea how that's working out, but I mean, it's a good move. You want to, like Ben says, you want to minimize exposure, but monetarily, I mean, how do you make that happen if you're living paycheck to paycheck? That's tough. That's why.
I'll tell you what, if they want to sell their house right now, who's going to buy in East Palestine? How many people that have worked for decades and lived in that community, which is basically only about 2,000 people, how are they going to sell their house to anyone? It's like selling beachfront property in Iowa. It's just not possible. No one's going to buy because it's not real. And no one's going to want to move into an area that is now at this point a toxic waste site, basically.
I mean, and that's a good point. I mean, could there be lawyer? And I do think that trial lawyers are the ones that actually hold these people accountable because we push the envelope far faster than the government does or anybody else. But I mean, is there ever situations like where you have these issues and people go in and lawyers will help create a fund to buy people's home at fair market value and then try to recoup that money from the bad doers, the evil doers? And I've seen this happen in hurricane cases where they'll come in and try to pay for everybody's roofs up front. The people can't afford to get a new roof and then sue the insurance company to finally get the money back from them. Are these things, I mean, I'm just putting my mind in East Palestine right now. Like, what are these folks going to do that really don't have a lot of options?
It's scary, man. I just remodeled my kitchen, and not to say this is equivalent at all, but I just remodeled my kitchen, and the contractor dug out all the floors to where I thought it was the last layer. I walk in one day and the dude's got another layer that he found with a bunch of old school looking tile, right? Dust everywhere. My son's literally in the living room. I'm just like, dude, you got to be kidding me. So I grabbed everybody and boned out. And that's just, one incident of something on a smaller scale. And I was petrified. I can't imagine what the folks in Ohio are thinking. Kids are getting acutely sick. They're getting headaches. They're getting bloody noses. You're seeing plumes of dark smoke in the air. I mean, it's got to be super scary and super concerning.
Not to mention the wildlife and the animals in the area are just dropping dead. And the fish in the water. This happened 20 days ago, and there's residents still asking the company and their CEO, Alan Shaw, what are you going to do? And literally, it's like he's been trained by a lawyer, a defense lawyer, and all he says, sound bites are, we're going to do what's right. Well, how about stop talking about what you're going to do and do something and help these people, put them up in housing somewhere where it's safe, figure out a way to minimize the dose, as Ben was suggesting earlier, and get them outside of harm's way, because the acute, immediate issues that they're feeling are just one thing. It's literally what's going to happen in 20 years, 30 years. That's what's really concerning. So I don't know.
Yeah. And so what are some of the other, I mean, we've talked about asbestos. We got into, East Palestine, Ohio, kind of what's going on there. I know there's stuff I hear about AFFF with firefighting foam. What are some of the things that people are finding out now that are super toxic to individuals and cases that you guys are working on that you're very passionate about?
There have been a handful of trials across the nation. I think awesome trial lawyer from California got a $2 billion verdict. Brent Wisner, is that the guy?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome job. I think there was one or two other verdicts. There was a couple defense verdicts, so it's something that we're all being exposed to in vegetables and fruits and foods that we eat.
Do you see, you guys study all these things all the time. Do we actually see more evidence of cancers in more developed countries due to man-made use in chemicals. I mean, is that a thing, or is it cancer's always just been around, but we're just hearing about more and more people being affected these past few years?
I asked my wife that same question last night, believe it or not.
I mean, it sounds
She's from El
wild, right?
Salvador. Yeah, she's from El Salvador. And like, it's a very rural area. There's not that much like man-made stuff. There's not a lot of fast food, I guess. Well, if you know where to find it, there is. But it's like, what if you just, kind of kept it simple and ate natural foods and, didn't expose yourself to a bunch of stuff, would you still get cancer? And she said that even her relatives, her older relatives in El Salvador, still she knows of some who got cancer. So I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it could have been because of some exhaust fumes or something in the plants I don't know about. But that's an awesome question, man.
Yeah, I think it's one time will tell. But we hear about Monsanto all the time as well. And so what happens? Like, Ben, you're hitting these verdicts for 20, 30, 50 million. I mean, are these just paper judgments, or do these companies actually have the funds and money to pay these things?
Most of them have the funds and money to pay them. There's always the threat of bankruptcy, not real bankruptcy like you're broke, bankruptcy like you're a big giant billion-dollar corporation and you want to put your assets in one company and liabilities in another and go bankrupt with the other. But we're hoping that will sort of stop after this Johnson & Johnson, after the Court of Appeals rejected their bankruptcy. But I just wanted to say something about the question you asked, Eric. One of the scary things about some of these chemicals is not just looking at them in isolation, but it's when you combine some of these chemicals together in someone's body. It's not like a 5+5 poisoning. It's like a 5 + 5 = 1,000 poisoning. There's a synergistic effect with combining some of these chemicals in people's bodies, where it's not just additive, but it's an exponential risk of cancer. So for example, smoking and asbestos, let's say smoking gives you is a 10 on the risk of lung cancer, and asbestos is a 10 on the risk of lung cancer. You combine them, it's not 20, it's not additive, it's like 100. It's a synergistic effect. So when we're drinking less sulfate and we're being exposed to asbestos and talc, and we've got secondhand cigarette smoke, and we've got God knows what else is in our air and our water and our food, and the companies are telling you through Exponent, well, it's a safe dose of each in isolation. Yeah, but when you combine them all together, God knows what can happen. So
yeah, how many times are things just done in strict isolation? I mean, we live like we're in the world, right? I mean, and that's what and I'm glad you guys, because I didn't think about bringing this up, was just these fraudulent studies that are out there. I mean, Mark, Eric, Ben, if you can think of some studies, or when you've been in trial and having to, I've had trials against major car manufacturers, and they're paying one expert alone $2 to $3 million to do all this shit, and it's all junk science. And it's just like, how are you going to expose this stuff? I'll start with Ben, and then I'll work with Eric and Mark to ask this question about kind of fraudulent studies and how you get around it.
It can be hard to because they cover it in scientific gobbledygook, like it has the facade of science, so you really got to dig and look under the hood. One example in the case we just tried that I thought is always kind of cracks me up is they did a study, I think it was Exponent, where they wanted to measure the levels of asbestos released from a work practice, which was like scraping a gasket off of an engine, like an asbestos containing gasket. And they said, look, we scraped the gasket off the engine, which is something that a lot of auto mechanics do. And there was pretty much no exposure. So, when your guy testified about scraping the gaskets off, I guess he wasn't exposed. Well, some smart lawyers filed motions to compel, subpoenas, and got the image of the wire brush that they used to scrape the gasket. It was literally a makeup brush. It couldn't scrape anything. It couldn't create dust out of anything. So they had scraped this burnt-on automotive gasket with a little powder brush. So of course there was no dust. But you never would have known that from the study. because it just said we used a wire brush to scrape the gasket. So that's just one example of how they absolutely rigged the tests.
Mm.
I mean,
It's
that's
crazy.
Yeah, and you should when there's so much money on the line. I mean, willing to do everything, and that's where I do think juries are getting more sophisticated with the quote unquote fake news or alternative facts, because you can really I make it a theme if I know what's coming. I make it a theme in jury selection. Who here have seen studies or headlines they're a little hesitant to believe, and if you get to the nitty gritty, that it shows something different. And I mean, Eric and Mark, you're next. I mean, can you tell us some of the things that you have to deal with in your trials, or these fake studies and shit that you have to deal with?
Yeah. So, Mark, you want to go?
Go ahead.
So, two stories come to mind. The first story I'm thinking of is probably a bit easier for me to think of right now. So, there's something called the cooling tower, and we're preparing for a trial against a cooling tower company called Marley Cooling Towers. What a cooling tower does is it takes hot water that comes from the circulating system, cools it down, and recirculates it for the most part. It's definitely more complicated than that, but that's like the layman's version. In the cooling tower, there's something that's called fill, which is it's like egg crates on the bottom where the water sits on that has asbestos in it. And there's something called louvers that sit to the side that allows cold air to come in and cool off the water. And those are also made of asbestos. And maintenance men, who my client was, have to come in and they have to drain the water out sometimes, and they have to scrape all like the residue off of the fill and scrape the residue off of the louvers. The defendants were using this study. I forget, it was either, I don't know the defense expert who did it off the top of my head, but they were relying on this study that said, yep, we had somebody do a work practice study like Ben was talking about, and he scraped off the louvers, and there is absolutely no release of asbestos. And it sucks because as a lawyer, you have to almost reevaluate your case, right? You're like, well, can I even take this to trial if the science is really against me? Maybe I have to tell my client, like, hey, listen, I know what you did, but we're really up against the wall here because they have a study that really kills us. So we really pressed the issue. And kudos to my partner, Patrick, on this, because he really pressed the issue. It turns out that the guy who did the study, so there was louvers on one side. I'm sorry, the louver was like a slat. One side was all asbestos, and if you flip it over, it was like a glaze that was not really asbestos. There was like a glaze covering it. And the guy who did the study, he was scraping off the glaze part, which is why there was no asbestos release. So... yeah, so I mean, it's really damaging because you can seriously take almost nothing for a case that, if you just dig a little deeper, could be a very, very good case because of the junk studies.
Yeah, and I've gone as far as I find out when they're doing these crash tests, and these expert groups are doing crash tests, and I'll send an investigator to go pocket cam it, because they always try to cover up what's really going on, and they write their study later. I mean, I have a few that I'm just waiting for them to come out what their result is and bust them on it. But shit, Mark, give me some of your fraudulent shit you see go down with these studies.
I mean, there's a bunch, but just a quick and easy one is it's almost similar to what everyone else has said and what you said. There's studies out there where the person testifying who did the study themselves is claiming that there's no exposure, and then you push them on the issue and you get video of the actual study, and they're wearing a fucking mask. And the result of the study is that there's no danger, no increased risk, but the entire time, them and the folks they're working with are wearing a mask. And, it's fun to unravel a study line by line and point out why this, what math equation is wrong, or, what they're doing is wrong. But it's almost more fun to show the jury a picture or a video that speaks so much more to, undercut the actual result than it's not dangerous. Why the fuck are you wearing a mask?
Yeah, and that's a good point. Is a lot of people don't know they videotape almost all of these, and if you ask the right questions, request the right documents, or see who did the studies and subpoena them if it wasn't them specifically to get the videos. If you're doing any lawyers doing any crap, if they're doing any biomechanical studies, get the video on some of these, because these dummies they're using are getting thrown around. They're trying to say they're not getting hurt. So, guys, we got about 5 more minutes here left on. first, thanks for coming on. But I just want to go around and just figure out why you are all passionate about kind of what you do. I always think about the movie The Rainmaker or Aaron Brockovich doing what you guys are out there doing. So Ben, why are you passionate and why do you get in the courtroom every day and help these folks?
Well, I'm a true believer in what we do. I mean, first of all of our clients die, 100%. And so I am inspired by people who spend some of the last weeks of their life giving testimony over video for a recovery that they'll never see. And it's really like, you really get to see people doing one last nice thing for their family because they're not going to be here to enjoy whatever comes out of the lawsuit. And I think that's pretty inspiring. I'm just inspired by our clients and also juries, people who sit for sometimes months on end, nothing to gain, sitting in LA traffic on a bus for days and days and days and just listening to testimony and getting it right. I mean, it's like, I don't want to be too cheesy, but it'll sort of, if you get too pessimistic about life, you should come watch one of these jury trials and some of these people who just sit there day after day after day and do what's right when they know how easy it is to get out of jury selection. When they could have not shown up, they could have made up an excuse. They saw the people say something crazy in jury selection to get off. They watched it happen, and they chose to stay when it would have been easier, probably not to. And so, things like that. I'm a true believer in what we do. I think it's righteous. There's a lot of money in it, and sometimes it can feel sort of like blood money because, I think all PI lawyers have that sort of balance. But I think what we do is righteous, and we help people. And I think we change corporate policy. I'm just a true believer. I love it.
And I do believe, for a lot of the cases you guys are trying, these are multiple week or month-long trials, months, right? So it takes a lot of dedication for you folks to be away from your friends and family and the juror services to do it. And Eric, do you think that being a trial lawyer, that you have changed the world or policy or the way corporations do things for the better?
I do, man. And, the only thing worse than getting terminal cancer is getting a terminal cancer that could have been prevented, and it's just such a sad thing to see these hardworking men and women that all they did was work for a living and try to provide for their families. And now they have this cancer that could have been prevented had a company taken precautions or warned or made a slight change to a design or something. It's just, I'm a true believer, just like Ben says, it's just the honor of a lifetime to help these people. And when you meet these people, I think we talked about this a little bit on Burden of Proof. I go around to the craziest parts. Bourbon. Yeah. Did I say bourbon? I go around, and I'm sure Ben and Mark have done the same. You go around to the smallest parts of the country and meet small town people. Sometimes have never seen a black dude before, and you just make this bond and this connection with these families. That's just, it's immeasurable. It's great work for great families. It's very heartwarming.
Yeah, I know you and both Eric Brown and Mark Bratt have a thing within Justice HQ is going to educate a lot of our members on kind of more of what you guys do and how you're out there helping the community. But so, like, Mark, why are you inspired? Because you've been doing this almost. You came right out of law school, I think, at Waters Krause doing this type of work. Like, how did you get into that right away and know what you wanted to do?
I'll be honest. I kind of lucked into it. I think you might know Kevin Lowe from Pepperdine as well, and he was taking the bar exam, and I was like, without knowing the firm he was at, I was desperate for a summer job, and I'm like, hey, since you're taking the bar exam, you think I can do what you were doing last summer? And he's like, well, I'll at least get you an interview. And so fortunately it worked out. And so from law school forward, I've been working in the asbestos toxic tort arena and have been fortunate enough to have been given the opportunity to try these cases, first chair them, hit some big verdicts, take on the toughest cases for families that are really in need. And, I echo what Ben and Eric have said. My goal is to make a difference. And yes, it would be great if I can make a larger difference for, the community and for, the world we live in. But at a minimum, I hope to enrich the lives of the families that are losing people that really they shouldn't be losing. I mean, these are man-made disasters, and I use that word not just for this Ohio situation, but the whole entire, asbestos-caused cancer world that we've been, living in and experiencing for decades should have been prevented. And none of these people should have cancer. They should be living their full lives with their families, and being able to step in and take the burden on my shoulders and help them through this process and hopefully get a good result. It's created lasting relationships. I text and call and stay in touch with the folks that have the cancer that are still alive, fortunately, regularly, as well as their families, making that impact immeasurable. But I will say this, and there's a credit to all the firms out there. It's not just, us on this podcast, but, let's just take Johnson & Johnson and the talc situation. They started getting sued in, I think, 2016. And under the cover of the pandemic is when they finally decided to stop selling talc in North America because they've been hit by, juries and rendered verdicts, in favor of the plaintiffs for tens of millions of dollars. They saw what was coming, but it took lawyers fighting on behalf of families and hitting verdicts and sometimes losing verdicts, but keep fighting to get to the point where Johnson & Johnson was forced to pull that off the market. And if nothing else, hopefully the future decades of people and babies that baby powder is used on will prevent future cancers and future injuries. So that's a testament to everyone's been fighting that fight.
So, for all of our listeners and viewers out there, I want to remind all of you that these cases and toxic torts are a very specialized area of law. It's not something that you can just pick up and learn and want to represent a client, think you're going to be able to try that case and win. It's one of those that you have to partner up with firms like Ben's or Eric's or Mark's to be able to be successful. I mean, I'm telling you that because I do not do toxic torts. Like, I will work with these guys on these types of cases. Spine, fusion injury cases, MVAs, anything on 4 wheels or 2 wheels, happy to do it. But these things, very specialized. So I want you to reach out to these folks if you have any questions that you have about these type of things. You can always go to justice.team or the Justice Podcast Network, anything like that if you have questions. So, Ben, thanks for coming on. Can you give everybody the quickest way for people to reach you, and then we'll go to Eric and Mark, and then we're going to get you on your way?
Sure. The easiest way to reach me is probably email badams@dobslegal.com, or I give my cell phone number out. I don't care. You can call me on my cell phone, 360-540-1877.
Where's dirty pics. No dirty pics, Bob.
Where's 3660 from?
It's Seattle, Olympia area where I went to high school and where I got a cell phone for the first time. I've never changed it.
Nice. Eric, how about you? How are people reaching you?
Check out our website, www.dbelegal.com. Check out some cool pictures of our office, cool pictures of our coffee machine. Get some info on what we do, or you can email me, brown@dbelegal.com.
You're not going to give your cell phone out?
No. Sure.
Okay. It's okay.
I just don't want you to send me any. I don't want any Bob Simon late night pics, dude.
those are middayers, bro. That's how I roll.
Hit my cell phone up, 310-729-9711.
I really hope that's somebody else's phone number you want to prank. But get Mark, how do we find you? How do listeners find you?
Yeah, you can check out my website, brattlawfirm.com. You can email me at mark@brattlawfirm.com, or text me, call me at my cell, 310-849-8789.
Yeah, so that's Bratt with 2 T's.
Oh, yeah, BRATT.
Yeah, for people that are listening. So, guys, thank you for coming on. Any questions, you go to justice.team. You can ask our chat bot there or email, and we'll be able to get you connected. So, guys, thank you for fighting the good fight and holding people accountable, because we know sure as hell the fucking companies aren't going to do it, and the government ain't going to give a shit until something disastrous happens. So, thank y'all.
Thank you for having us.